Hello, and welcome to Research the News. As always, we have a sponsor this week that's not a real sponsor because we're, as I've said before, not large enough for a real sponsor. I don't know if I have to say that every week. I keep saying it. I just don't want to get sued if, we have Aldi as a sponsor and maybe they don't want to sponsor us. So just to be clear, this is our disclaimer. We just like these products. And this week, I'm actually going to bring on Gretchen to talk about this week's fake sponsor. So Gretchen, who's our sponsor this week?
This week's sponsor is Universal Yums. Get a box for your friend or loved one. These are actually really cool. Can you tell us about
Universal Yums?
Yeah, so Universal Yums is a company that puts together care packages that send you snacks from all over the world. So my sister, shout out to Heather, gave me this for Christmas, and they come in a couple different sizes, but you basically get a bunch of candy and chocolates and chips from like the Netherlands or Italy or Germany, or that's all I've gotten so far. So that's all I can talk about. But I have a tiramisu chocolate ball that I have been saving. That is about to call my name in about an hour.
You should actually chew it during the show at some point when Andrew's talking to just distract from whatever he's saying.
It would be perfect to lighten the mood.
I actually love the idea. So I've looked in I will say, there's food that I've had from around the world when I've traveled that I love. Prawn crisps from England. They sound gross, but they're really good.
It does sound gross.
Guinness beer chips from, they're mostly chips. I like chips or crisps,
well,
as they call them.
These are from Germany, I believe. Is that where these ones are from? These are garlic rye wheat bread chips, and they are going to be so good. Yeah. But my favorite were Stroop waffles. Sponsors.
Oh, I love Stroop waffles.
Yeah,
I can't wait till we get real sponsors, though, and they only get 20 seconds of a commercial and they pay for it. And we're giving this Universal Yum people like 3 minutes of time.
Yeah, so they should. Everybody should do it. It's fun.
As always, we're live, so there's going to be no edits if you're listening to this as a podcast on Monday. But we are starting out this week's episode of Research the News by going over what we talked about last week in Research News. And you know what? I forgot to do the theme music, so I'm just going to hit the theme music. It's weird because I'm used to doing it myself, and now you're on air, so I hit the theme music. There we go. We crossed that off the checklist. But last week we talked about prison reform. So we had Caitlin on the show, and I feel like I learned a lot. Gretchen, how did you feel about last week?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it all week, actually. So I talked to my mom this morning, and we were discussing parts of the episode. She still hasn't watched a full episode. She just watches the clips. And so I was telling her that episode was so eye-opening, things that I did not know were going on, just because I don't know anybody who's in prison. So, or I do know people in prison, so I just don't talk to them. But yeah, it was incredibly eye-opening, and it made a really big impact on me and how I view the whole prison and justice reform in general.
And that's what we're here for. So last week we talked about prison reform. Actually, we want to have Caitlin back on the show. We already talked with her about maybe filling in. Gretchen also has a real full-time job, so there's going to be some episodes where she's not going to be able to make it. So we've already talked with Caitlin as a potential backup for some of those episodes. We really did enjoy her. Feel free to check that out. You can see the episode from last week either on video on researchthenews.com or researchthenews.org or researchthe.news if you don't want to type as much. All the information is there. As always, the links that we're talking about today are posted on researchthenews.org. They have all of the articles that we reference here, so you can go back and research the news yourself. This week, we're talking about Asian race relations, and I'm bringing on one of my favorite people in life. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Gretchen. It is great to be here today.
Andrew actually told me when we were warming up, you don't have to mention that you know me. It doesn't look like it's an inside job, but I actually love Andrew. He's one of the most honest people that I've ever met. And we worked together for 4 or 5 years and had some great conversations, and wanted to reach out to him when we were talking about this episode. So Andrew, we always play a game called What's Your Bias? So we're talking about Asian race relations this week. What are your biases?
Oh, wow. Well, that is an an awesome question. Nothing to make you feel comfortable than to be immediately asked about your biases. But I have many. My first bias is that I am an Asian man, and that will be a different perspective than an Asian woman. And there's only so much space for guests. So I'm an Asian man, but you're missing an Asian woman today. To be a great perspective.
True.
I also am adopted. I was adopted as an infant from Korea and raised by a white American family. So that's definitely an interplay that creates a bias. I think another bias that I would say that I have is I'm definitely would consider myself a follower of Jesus, although that doesn't necessarily align with what the culture, would sort of place on that, when they hear that. So that's probably me for today.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. Well, I'll go through mine. Clearly, well, not clearly, but I'm not an Asian man. I did a DNA test, and I do have very small amounts of Southeast Asian in my DNA test. So I'm basically the Elizabeth Warren of Southeast Asia. So, but in general, I'm white. I also, too, I think there's some things, we'll get into it later, but talking with Andrew, there was a huge bias that came up for me in the sense of there were some things he was talking about that happened to him. And I know Andrew, and he's, again, one of the most honest people I've ever met. So hearing him say that these things happened to him, if I would have saw that on Twitter or someone in passing that I didn't know, I may not have, it sounded like it's just wouldn't have happened. So that's some of my bias that I didn't realize I had. I'm a little dismissive sometimes of things that sound crazy, but apparently these crazy things actually happen. So that's a big bias on my part. And that's something that, I feel like this conversation, that's what I'm hoping to get out of it, is to understand more about where you're coming from. Also, too, I think there is a bias towards some of the media narratives that I feel like a lot of situations come up when it's convenient, and we start talking about difficult conversations when it's convenient to push a narrative. And so I'd like to hear kind of your thoughts about some of the media influences in these situations. So those are my biases. Gretchen?
My bias is I am a white woman in my 40s. I grew up in a small town. We kind of talked about this last time. I grew up in a small town that had one Asian family, one Black family, and one Indian family. And we were very far from any other large areas. So we really didn't see a lot of ethnic diversity or religious diversity. I grew up in a very conservative area. I am very liberal. So I live in Pittsburgh and I'm an artist. I'm around a lot of different ethnic minorities, different religions. And I find that I feel like I'm a very accepting person. I am not religious, so but I'm very supportive of anybody who wants to be. So I feel like my empathy kind of plays a higher role in my moral compass, and it informs my decision making usually and the way I view the world. So where Ray is more dismissive, I'm more. I guess the word would be maybe compassionate.
Oh my goodness, that is such a liberal thing to say right there. Well, where Ray is so dismissive of any problems, so I'm just so compassionate that I just am empathetic to them all.
We joke that Ray is very logical, and I am very allow my heart to lead more things, and I am less logical, and we balance each other out a little bit.
It's good,
but that's where my heart usually leads me places instead of my head. So I am very, very excited to hear you talk today, Andrew, because these are things that and when I was speaking this morning with some other people kind of bending their ears about the topic today, it was interesting to hear how differently our educational system has approached race relations and things that have happened racially in our past. I did not learn about things that have happened to Asian Americans the way that my mother did. She learned a lot. She knew so much more than I thought she did. And I was like, I learned all of this in the last week. And she knew it since she was in 7th grade. So that was kind of interesting to me.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get to Andrew here. And before we do, I just want to say, I think there's the last thing I'll say quickly here is that when we're starting out by saying our backgrounds and our ethnicities, I feel like sometimes when I'm hearing shows and hearing people talk about race relations, they say things like, I'm a white male and so I shouldn't speak, and I'm a white female and I shouldn't speak. That's not what we want here. That's not why we said that. So if you're a first time listener, just know that that doesn't mean that we're going to ask hard questions, or we're going to ask questions that help us to hopefully understand each other more and not try to hide. So that's something that's important about us. But when I hear that terminology of I'm a white male and I'm biased, and oftentimes that means you can't speak, but that's not what we want here. We want people to be able to talk and understand each other. So with that being said, Andrew, I think we're going to hand it right over to you. We always start out with a definition. And so there's been a hashtag going around about Stop Asian Hate. And Andrew, do you want to unpack that for us? What does Asian hate mean to you?
Oh, man. Well, Asian hate is very complex. I think the first thing we've got to understand is that Asian is such like a broad term in the sense that like pretty much correct my statistics, but I feel like a third of the world could come to America and be called Asian. So it's such a broad term of people that are from different cultures, different nations who, eat different food, speak different languages, and look very different. So, when we talk about Stop Asian Hate, I think there's a big, feeling amongst the Asian community, and there's 20 million Asians in America today. So that's 20 million different experiences. I obviously can only speak from my own experience, but I think there's this one idea that, Asian hate is sort of like a greater community just making you feel like the perpetual foreigner. Asian hate is the fact that, there's an assumption that, do you speak English? And, it's surprising if you speak really good English, even if you've lived here your whole life. Asian hate in a lot of senses is, minimalizing the Asian man as, non-masculine, and just sort of get out of the way. You're sort of, in some senses, you have no sexual presence. But then for the Asian woman, there's issues of being fetishized. There's issues of being hypersexualized in the view of the culture. So you have these sort of opposite spectrums. But I think a lot of it sort of mixes together to sort of, in some sense, you can start feeling like you're on the outside. So it's a hate of exclusion. I think for many, many years, you look back to the 19th century where you even had something that passed our Congress and was approved, signed into law by the president, called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So exclusion, I think, is a term that we see in regards to, any sort of hatred toward the Asian community in America. And I think, again, there's always been, I think we are seeing more attention in the media to some violent elements of that hate manifesting itself to violence. I think a lot of situations of hatred toward Asian Americans have really not manifested in violence over the years. But, whether that's new or not, there is a fresh spotlight being shown on that aspect of, Asian hate. Hence, the hashtag Stop Asian Hate or Stop AAPI Hate.
Well, and I think a couple things there for people who are tuning in and may not know AAPI, that's Asian American and Pacific Islander. So that's the term if you hear that going around. The Chinese Exclusion Act, this is interesting because Gretchen had talked about some of the things we've learned in educational settings. I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act about a year ago. I mentioned the Constitutional podcast last week, and I was listening to an episode of that show, and they talked about it. For people who don't know, it was in 1882, and it banned all Chinese laborers from entering the United States. And it's actually the first and the only law that was ever actually implemented. There were other laws that were put forward that didn't pass, but the first and only law to prevent all members of an ethnic or national group from immigrating to the U.S. So that was 1882. There was a big constitutional debate about that issue, and that's something, if you haven't looked it up, it's a very interesting subject about why it happened and the kind of the legal cases that go around it, especially when it ties into the Constitution. So there's a few things that you can look up. I think there's a link about the Chinese Exclusion Act on researchnews.org. But with that all said, Andrew, I think this is new for a lot of us. We've I think we've always known that. I mean, everyone knows there's racism. Everyone knows there's issues. Everyone knows there's a problem with all kinds of different things. But the Asian hate seems to have popped up pretty quickly. And I'm sure maybe people were talking about it earlier, but it seems just really snowballed into something that hit over the past month or so. But when I was talking with you offline, I feel like this has been happening to you your whole life. So is this something that's more recent? Have you seen any kind of change, or is this something that's you've been experiencing since you were a kid?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ray, because without a doubt, the media lens toward this was pretty much non-existent for the first, 36 years of my life. And I guess that's a side note that I always get mistaken for like a college student or high school student. So, you reach an age where that's a compliment.
Yeah.
It's
That's just because
frustrating.
you're youthful exuberance. I know you.
Thank
And
you,
it's just
Ray.
because
Thank
you're
you, Ray.
such a happy-go-lucky, young-looking man. It's great. It's a compliment.
Thank
it's a
you.
compliment. Yeah.
And you know something, Ray? You don't look a day over like 19 right now.
Oh, geez.
Once you,
Let's just
clean
forget
shaven,
the rest
like,
of the podcast.
I would have
Let's
mistaken you for like a college freshman. New man on campus.
Let's skip the rest of the episode. We don't need to learn more about what's happening with race relations. Let's just compliment each
not
other.
at all.
So yeah, let's. All right, sorry, I got us off topic. But Andrew, go ahead. You were talking about being mistaken for a college student, and I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah, and when we talk about is this a new phenomenon, and I think the reality is it isn't, but there hasn't really been a lens to it. I think a lot of times, there is a narrative in our news, and that narrative doesn't know what to do with certain difficulties to one group, especially when how they come upon that difficulty doesn't necessarily fit any narrative. Or just be honest that for Asians in America, and again that represents a lot of nationalities, a lot of different groups, especially with, I think, a lot of Americans. A lot of people will use Chinese interchangeably with Asian. And obviously, like, I can't imagine being like from Sri Lanka or Pakistan or India and getting that. But, for someone, whether they're, Vietnamese or Japanese or Korean, it's all Chinese. Sometimes I can be a little smart. I'll just be honest. Ray knows that. I'm sure Gretchen knows that now. So, when I would get that comment, even when I'm an adult, if someone, says, "Are you from China?" If they're white, I'll ask them, "Are you from France? Are you from Austria, Poland? Let me guess, Poland, right?" And they'll be like, "What the heck?" I also live in a community that's majority African American. My wife is black. I don't have a black card though, because I will always be Asian. But if it's a kid, or an adult who says, "Are you from China?" I'd be like, "Are you from Nigeria?" It's the largest country
None of these
in
things
Africa.
I can say, by the way. I just to be clear, it's good that you can say these things, but I can't. There's no.
Because
I'm
people,
sure it is. It makes
people who
it
aren't
makes
white
light of that. Yeah.
can be a little more free with issues of race. Total side topic, but you will understand the heart of this. That when I was in college, there was a class that met right next to ours, and we shared the same professor. And they were all white except for one, girl that was African American. She was black. And I can remember my classmates in our class one day trying to describe her. And but they were white, so they couldn't say she was black. So they're like, "Yeah, she's the one, she's a little, darker complexion." And they're like, "Oh, who?" So sometimes her hair's in braids, so sometimes, there's a weave or there's strain. You're like, "I still don't know who you're talking about." Well, but she's brown eyes. And this went on for like 3 minutes. And finally I'm like, guys, she's black. And they're like, "Oh yeah. But they were so scared and dancing around that feeling oh, that's not my place to say somebody is, black or Asian or Hispanic or, but I think, okay, that's a side issue, and I don't want to make this a 2.5-hour podcast, so I'm moving. But yes, Asian hate, it's not new, but it takes a lot of forms. From my experiences, when you're a kid, you start to learn that, there's some things that people do that are malicious. And even if it's not racial at all, other kids and adults can do malicious stuff, But when you're an Asian kid, you would get a lot of ching chong, which just sort of makes you feel like a knife cutting you in the chest. You get a lot of slanty eyes, and this is something that, again, I can't control the fact that I have really cool eyes. So it's like, what am I going to do about that? And then, beyond that, there's a lot of side comments, a lot of sort of making you feel like you're the other, like you're the foreigner, like you're sort of outside of what's standard or acceptable. And again, that can happen among a number of different races and cultures of people. There's hatred toward Asians in America, and I think this does speak to the news, honestly. It's not mutually exclusive. That when you grow up in America as Asian, pretty much whatever your community you're in, you can be the target of that hatred. If you grow up in a white community, you can be the target of hatred from people who are white. Doesn't mean every white person, but people who are white. If you grow up in a community that is majority Black, you will be the target of people who are Black. If you grow up in a community that is majority Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, you will be the target of that community. Again, doesn't mean that everybody is necessarily has a bigoted view towards you, but you just know that hate, can come from, there's a lot of different flanks that hatred can come towards you.
Do you think it comes do you think it comes out of the model minority thing that came out of the 80s?
The model minority, it's sort of funny because
before we talk about the model minority, can we just explain that? Because I think it's an interesting topic, but do you want to explain to us what that means, Andrew, for anyone who may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, so the model minority is sort of this concept of, hey, Americans, and hey, specifically, non-white Americans, look at the Asians. They're doing really good. Their kids are getting through school and they're graduating from college. Hey, they own businesses. They don't really complain that much in life. They pay their taxes. They go to
their
church or whatever they do.
Yeah.
They're just good model citizens. They're not filling up rap sheets. They're not being arrested by the cops. Be like the Asians. And, I think for me, growing up in a white family, I didn't really have a concept of that, honestly. So that's, a bias that I hold. But I think the more you learn about it, you realize that it does take on a little bit of a, you think about elementary school and you had that teacher who's like, why can't you be like Katie? Or why can't you be like Danny? They do all their homework. They never talk back, and they always get A's. They hold the door for the other kids and they share their lunch money. And no one really likes, like, I'm not Katie. I'm not, Danny.
Right.
And, I realize that for other groups in this country, it can sort of feel like that, and usually in this country, the majority culture is the one saying, be like the Asians, other minorities.
Yeah.
So it's a little of a conflicted concept, to say the least.
Yeah.
There's a video that is also linked on the Wikipedia page that Gretchen posted, and one of the guys in there is talking about the model minority myth. And one of the things he said is actually interesting to me, and I want to unpack this a little bit because one of my issues in general when people talk about race, and this is grossly generalizing both conservatives and liberals, but with oftentimes what I found is that conservatives just kind of say, well, it doesn't really exist. Like, racism isn't around. There's no issues with race. It's all made up. And liberals kind of oftentimes see it in everything. And so no matter what you do, it's always underlined with it's a racist thing. And one of the things they were talking about when they talked about the model minority myth, they said, whenever he does something well, and this is the guy who was hosting the video, many people cite that it's because he's Asian, and people mean it as a compliment. But he says specifically, this is quoting, but really think about how attributing an individual's success to their race undercuts their accomplishment and their individuality. And when I hear that, that makes complete sense to me. And at the same time, it also brings up questions where I didn't realize even oftentimes if I'm playing sports with people who are Black, it's typically I'm not going to be as good at basketball as a generalization. And there's this idea of like, well, if you're playing and there's a Black guy and a white guy, you're probably going to pick the Black guy because he's probably better. And it's like, oh, wait a second, that's kind of racist there. And I start to see that, and I also see how that applies a little bit to the whole idea of white privilege. So I hear that and I think, well, isn't that kind of the same thing as attributing an individual's success to their race and undercutting accomplishment, individuality? When people hear, if you're a white person, you hear about white privilege, it's kind of like, well, wait a second, stop. Like, I've done things myself. And when you say white privilege, it undercuts that personal accomplishment. I'm not comparing racism to people being said that they have some kind of privilege, because I think there is a measure of privilege just for being white. But we all have our own privileges. We all have our own identities. And I think that's the thing that I want to get to the core of when we talk about race, is the fact that oftentimes another part of the video, there was a woman there who talked about how she was half Filipino and half Black, and she's an advocate in this space. And she said she saw a huge need for these two communities to come together because we're not each other's enemies. And when I hear that, I'm watching this video and it's all about stopping Asian hate. And I'm like, this could really stop all hate if we look at each other not based on race, whether it's white, Black, Asian, but we look at people as people. So that's me on a soapbox saying that that's what we should be doing, I think, as a society. But how do you, as an Asian American, I know there's differences that you see in how I think African Americans are treated, Asian Americans are treated, white people are treated. How do you see a common bond there that maybe people can come together and understand how we can move forward together and not so separated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point that you bring up, Ray. That I mean, quite honestly, the first thing that we need to do is sort of like honestly throw politics to the side.
Yeah.
Throw talking heads, throw what the media is trying to push on us. Let's throw that to the side and deal with people again as people, and build relationships with people who maybe look different than us, who come from different communities, different neighborhoods, have different upbringings. I think that really, if we unleash that, then there's so much potential to start to not only see the commonalities that we might have, because trust me, one thing I think is beautiful when we think about what brings Americans together, I think if I was president, I would give an award to the WWE. The WWE, like Vince McMahon. Talk about bringing people together. Like, think of any other space in the history of the world where think about the group of people who just love studio wrestling.
Yeah.
You've got like white, people that, my apologies to my family from Virginia who's white, white rednecks who love it, and then you have like, I work in an inner city community. You have all the kids, predominantly African Americans. They just love WWE. They never miss like Monday Night Raw. And you're like, wow, like the WWE is bringing people together, under like this great umbrella of like power bombing and, throwing people through tables, but that unites us in a beautiful way. They would get an award. That's like the presidential medal of doing an awesome job right there.
That should be a new thing.
I think that is actually WrestleMania is coming up April 10th and 11th, by the way. I'm also a WWE fan. I have been since I was a kid. And it's funny you bring that up because we actually watched the pay-per-views together with a group of guys, and it was a great mix of different ethnic backgrounds, and we all just enjoyed the stupidity of WWE. And I will say, let me just say, this is a complete side note as well, but I actually interviewed a wrestler for a previous job. We had this 5K race series, and it was this wrestler, and he was talking about how he gets really mad when people say it's fake, and he was like, what's your favorite movie? And I was like, well, at the time it was Anchorman. He was like, it's fake, and he yelled at me and said it's fake, and I was like, well, no, I know it's fake, but why are you telling me that? And he was like, yeah, that's how I feel every time someone tells me it's fake. So I think there is something there, but at the same time, Andrew, it's interesting you bring that up because right now they're scrubbing WWE's back catalog when they're going to the Peacock network because there's all kinds of racist things. Roddy Piper came to the ring wearing blackface for a WrestleMania event. Vince McMahon himself actually said the N-word in a sketch, and they had to scrape that. So it's one of those things but it's interesting to me that Hulk Hogan had all that stuff that came out about him being racist. And despite all of that, and despite the fact that I will say as a historian of WWE, there haven't been many non-white champions. And recently that's changed, but it's been a long history of white people that are champions, but people still get behind.
You always have to ruin a good thing. Right?
I'm sorry. It's funny. I'm the more conservative guy in this show, and I feel like I'm the progressive now. That bad WWE. But it's interesting you bring that up. What do you think it is though? And I know this was a side note, but what is it about WWE that brings people together? So because there are some really controversial things in there, but you're right. When you look at the crowd, it's a very diverse crowd.
Yeah, I think that just speaks that people don't enjoy controversy. I don't think they enjoy canceling people. They don't enjoy feeling like everybody is walking on pins and needles in our society. And I think in this case, they just want to be entertained by I'm watching my words because I'm thinking of your friend who was the wrestler, but they just want to be entertained by pure, athletic sports entertainment taken to the nth degree.
And there you go.
Yep. There you go. That's a really nice way of saying it. So yeah.
You're welcome.
All right. So away from wrestling, something I feel like you brought up a few stories when you were telling me that I would, like I said, I would not have believed. And I think there's something here where, again, I want to come back to ignorance versus racism, because I think oftentimes, as someone who believes there are race problems, but also believes that those are better than they have been in the past, I always get confused when people say, I had someone tell me about a year and a half ago, I was on a date actually, and she told me that the U.S. is more racist now than it's ever been. And I was kind of surprised by that, because we used to have slavery and we used to be able to own people. So the fact that right now we're more racist than ever is just not a fact. That's
not a fact, no.
But that's the impression a lot of people have. But I do think that these things are going down, but there are still issues. With that being said, what would you say? You've given some examples of, I mean, when people say ching chong, like you said, and when people are making the eye motions, you see it. I mean, I see it. I go, okay, that's racism. Mm-hmm. And then there are some things where you talk about ignorance. And I think that's an interesting part for you to talk about. You mentioned before the show about the kids that came up to you recently in one of your gyms that you work in. For those people who don't know, Andrew works with high school kids in athletic settings. So tell me about what you
Younger
consider
kids
ignorance
too,
versus racism.
Anything from 4-year-olds and up. So it's a wide variety. But yeah, I can think of, when I think about ignorance versus sort of prejudice, and, there's ignorance is basically you just don't know. I can remember when I was in college and, something happened on our campus and the Asian Student Association, like they used the word Oriental. And honestly, I had no idea that I was supposed to be offended by Oriental. So I did some research. I understood, started to learn the origins of that word, and that this was definitely sort of an imperialistic European term. And I heard all that and I'm like, okay, yeah, I see it. But at the same time, if someone who was 75 or 80, comes up to me and uses the term Oriental, and I know this person generally has a good heart, I'm probably not going to hold that against them. Mm-hmm. Count that up for ignorance, Right. I might want to tell them, hey, some Asians definitely find this word offensive. Here's why. So, someone who isn't like me might take offense to that. I think of kids who will come up to me, they don't know much Asian Americans, and they'll say, hey, do you know karate? Or, hey, can you cook fried rice? I love fried rice. And this is, kids are curious. Kids are curious, and, they're not mocking me, but their curiosity gets the best of them, because, hey, they might have all these, questions for Asian people. They're watching Cobra Kai, but they don't have any outlet to ask these questions too. So, again, when I get those questions, I usually use it as an educational moment for them. I might tell them, honestly, I don't know martial arts. I don't know karate, but maybe we can take lessons together one day. Maybe we can both learn. And they're like, yeah, that would be cool. So there's opportunity when we face ignorance to use that to educate, and to not, again, there has to be a place for grace in our society. I'm not going to get all bent over backwards out of that, but I will say, hey, let's learn from this and let's get to a better place. Mm-hmm. Flip side, we talk about hatred, we talk about bigotry, we talk about, views that are racist and actions that are racist. I can think of in 2016, I went to vote. I think probably a lot of people went to vote in 2016, hopefully 2018 and 2020. And I live in a community where we vote in a public housing project, and or a public housing authority community. I want to use the right terminology, and they have it in the rec room. And I was walking up into this sort of complex of different apartment buildings, and I hear, hey, Chinaman, ching chong, speak Chinese. And I look to my right, and there's a man and a woman. They're probably in their 30s or 40s, and at first you're just shocked, like that someone would say that. And but again, this is only because of Jesus. I said, hey guys, I can't speak Chinese either. I only speak English. And they didn't really take that, but it was one of those things where it was so jarring, and unfortunately I didn't, say I want to fight you, but it's like, oh my gosh, this is really intense. So I went inside of, the housing community, and there were some community organizers and there were some poll workers. And I said, hey guys, I was just racially accosted, right as I was walking in here to vote. And, the first woman, I don't know if she was a community organizer or she was, just a poll worker. She's like, they ain't one of us. They don't even vote. And I'm sort of thinking, well, that's not all that reaffirming to me. What does that have to do with anything? You're just trying to get people to vote because you don't like Trump, obviously. But at the same time, have some empathy for me. And then there's this other guy who was a poll worker who's like, I'll take care of this. So he goes outside. And this is a really funny story because it'll continue. So I go and I vote that day. And, there was a really nice interracial couple there. The husband was black, the wife was white. And they're like, hey, we want to give you a ride home. And I walk a lot around my community, so I didn't need a ride home. But I felt that, when we talk about, hashtag Stop Asian Hate, I appreciated that they were willing to put themselves between me and people who were trying to racially accost me, and say, hey, he's with us. We're going to give you a ride home like you're with us. And I appreciate that when I think about a model of just what that looks like to really be an ally. I see that man, I see that woman. I haven't seen them since, but I'm definitely so grateful, that I ran into him that day. And getting back to that poll worker, this big dude, supposedly, and my wife tells me about this, and I didn't even remember it. A few years later, we go to vote again. And since then, they've actually torn down the housing project. And now we vote in another location. And he's like, oh, it's you. Man, I almost got into a fight for you. And I'm like, I feel that. Like, again, like,
Thank you.
We need you. You're the man. Like, I'd hug you. This was before COVID. I should have hugged him.
Yeah.
And I'm like, all right, that dude was willing to get in a fight for me because he said that's just not right.
No.
Right.
So I think about allies. I think about, what does that look like to stop Asian hate? And it's that intentionality there, and saying, I'm gonna stand with you, and even if that means someone wants to fight me now,
Right.
Well, and I think,
I think it is beautiful. And I think allies is a great term because I would consider myself someone who, I want to be an ally. I think that's a good word for it. And I think it's a lot of education though. And I mean, there's things I look back. So Andrew and I, we met in 2009 or something. It's been 2008, maybe 10, 12 years.
Yep.
And
My
I mean,
first
we
day
went
of
through a
work,
list.
You took me on a 2.5-hour lunch break.
That's right. Wow.
Shocking.
I
Not
forgot
shocking.
about that.
Someone
That's
just
right.
didn't want to work, I guess.
Yeah. No, I wanted to spend time with you. I feel like we had good conversations even then.
I appreciate
Wow.
it.
That is,
Yeah.
I remember that.
Mike and
fun.
Tony's.
Yeah. I love Mike
We
and
got
Tony's.
gyros,
Good gyros
or
if you're in
gyros if
Pittsburgh.
you're not from Pittsburgh.
Yeah. So, but I think that's one of the things where when we were talking before the show, there were things that popped up, and we don't need to go down the list, but there were things that there was not any ill intent on my part, but there were things that I've done where I go, oh man, like I shouldn't have done those things. And there were even things that, we talked about where, we won't get into details, but I had a website that Andrew wrote an article for, and he's like, maybe I do things differently looking at it. And we all learn and grow, and we all can hopefully, understand each other more. And I think that's the important part. I mean, I'll say this actually started coming up in my mind, the Asian hate part. And this goes back to what Gretchen was saying about her mom being more educated than she was on history. I was in Wyoming in September, and I went to the Heart Mountain Relocation Center. If you're not familiar with the relocation centers in the U.S., they were basically internment camps for Japanese people who were in the U.S. during World War II. So this is near Cody, Wyoming. It was near the airport there. It's a beautiful area, just wonderful wildlands. And they had what looked like an internment camp you would see in Nazi Germany, where they took Japanese Americans and put them there because Franklin D. Roosevelt, who on a side note is not one of my favorite presidents. It's probably the closest to a dictator we ever had. And this is a whole nother episode, but he was the original person to try to pack the courts for the New Deal. And luckily at that point, people stood up. Congress and the population said, no, that's an undemocratic power grab, although they elected him to office 4 times. Anyway, side note of all that, FDR started these internment camps where they rounded up Japanese Americans and put them into these camps. And I mean, there are a lot of stains in our history in America, and I think that we have to talk about them and move on from them, and hopefully never do them again. But that's one that's a big one for me. But so those things, again, it's like I see that and I'm go, okay, wow, that was a racist part of our history.
Yeah.
And I look at when people say ching chong, like, wow, that's racist. But those little things that I may not even have known, I think it's so important to have these kind of conversations. And one of the ones you brought up, you were on a trip, not to bring up all the hurts you've had in your life, Andrew, but
that's okay.
You were on a trip recently, I guess about a year or so ago with your wife, to where was it, the Bahamas?
Oh yeah, we were actually in Jamaica, and we were. So this is humorous, you'll appreciate this. Like, it's one of those resorts that, like, they hound you for the first few days with their timeshare presentation.
Oh, right.
But you just sort of have to do it, and you got a bag of goodies, so you just do it, and you're not really wanting to buy a timeshare, but it just, like, it gets them off your back.
Sure.
They pretty much have, like I'm sure, I mean, I think about, man, if we were all like as like on as them, like this world would be changed.
Yeah.
But they're persistent. So, we're walking around for this timeshare, and then this manager, he's one of the hotel managers, within earshot of me, he sees me, and I hear him say under his breath, Jackie Chan.
Oh, what?
And
what?
I hear that sometimes with kids, and I don't like it. And that's almost a little beyond ignorance, but I explained to them why I don't like that. But this was like an at least 40-year-old man, who's a hotel manager in a position of authority, who sees an Asian guest and says, Jackie Chan. And that made me boil. And, one thing, honestly, I love is that a lot of times, the stereotype on Asians is that we're dismissive, that we don't speak up. I love that my wife has changed that in me.
That's good.
That she makes me. So I spoke up, like I got his manager, and pretty much said, this is unacceptable that I'm going to be treated like this here.
Yeah.
And, maybe you ask, well, I like Jackie Chan movies. Why is that offensive? Well, growing up in America as, an Asian man, an Asian boy, there was two people that, most people saw that were Asian through the popular culture. One was Jackie Chan, and then the other was Bruce Lee. So growing up anywhere from the 70s through the 90s, kids would see you and they'd say Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee, or they'd do the little hiya, martial arts sort of, mimicking. And when you knew that their intent was hurtful, you definitely internalize that to hear the name Jackie Chan, that's hurtful. It triggers you. They're coming after you, mocking you.
Yeah.
And again, 8-10-year-old boy, one thing, 45-year-old man, no, your intentions are not pure.
Yeah.
You're doing that to demean me.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to have that. I tolerate a lot, but let me speak to your manager.
Yeah.
You went all Karen on him.
I was Karen on this guy. Yeah. And there was a moment, and he lectured me that I need to be less sensitive because he said, I'm from Mexico and, we call everybody names. And it's like, well, that doesn't make y'all right.
No.
But there was a moment where he felt like, man, I should have just not said that. I could see it because they had, he was sitting around, waiting for the manager to come back. And he's thinking, man, I should have just held my tongue, in that instance. And it's like, all right, maybe he didn't learn anything but that. Maybe the next Asian guest who came to this resort in Jamaica didn't have to be called Jackie Chan when they walk by.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting because, that's one of those things that gets difficult because I understand, number one, I kind of innately understood that would be racist even without hearing your explanation for it. But when you said specifically, there are only a few different people in the Asian culture that you were referred to, you kind of get narrowed down to this box. And that really impacted me when you told me about that. And also I think it's difficult because as a white person, I do get, do you look like this person or, there's all these comparisons. My best friend says I look, and for those not watching the video and listening to this on podcast, don't look up pictures of me. You'll have a much better impression than what I actually look like.
Ray is a very handsome man. Just let me tell you that.
Okay. Thank you again, Andrew. My best friend used to call me Chris Hemsworth, the Thor guy. And he's much better looking than I am, but I don't take any offense to that. I immediately go, well, thank you.
You're like, thanks.
That's great. Like keep bringing it on. And for example, when I was in, I remember talking to a friend of mine who was black after I came back from Colombia, the country. Most people there were shorter than me. I'm a 6'4" white guy. I stood out. Everyone was staring at me. I loved it. Like I ate it up. And it's something though, a couple of things you've said that hit me are, that's you're comparing, there's a lot of different comparisons. It's not, I mean, it's Chris Hemsworth because there might be a very vague resemblance to him. And when it comes to walking around and being recognized, that's not something that typically happens to me. So when it happens all the time, and that's the same thing that my friend who is black, who I told that about, said, that's something that happens all the time, and it gets really old. And you had talked about how, you like to have these learning moments where you can explain to people, here's why what you said is wrong. Yeah. But it really shouldn't be your job to have to do that 10, 12, 15 times a week, whatever it may be. But that's an extra burden that goes on you that I didn't really recognize before you and I started talking. And I think that's an important thing when you're having discussions about race. I think oftentimes that goes back to the ignorance versus prejudice conversation, because you see these things as a white guy and it's like, well, people are looking at me, great, like this is so cool, like, but you don't experience it the same way that someone who is a minority experiences it. And I think those are the things that are powerful and things that we can hopefully be able to start allowing people to understand that this is why they're important. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's an important thing. And I think one of the things you brought up in our conversations before as well, that it was just an interesting subject, is that you mentioned that you were adopted. So you're raised by white parents. Yeah. And we were talking about the shooting that happened in Atlanta. Yeah. And I'm not going to give away the ending here, but you said something that really struck me and made me think about that situation. And I asked you how you felt about that. And I'm just going to let you take it from here and explain what you told me.
Yeah, definitely, Ray. That I think for a lot of us who, are Asian, but we were adopted to America and predominantly were raised in white families, to see just a horrific crime like that really left us a little bit in shock, but also just like it just was a reiteration of how out of place we feel. Because here we have a situation where, the victims were Asian American, many of the victims, and, especially for Asian American women, like that could have been me. That could have been me. But for those of us who are adopted, we have this extra strange tension that is just like, I don't know what to do with it. Like just drop it on the floor and run or something. That like we see the shooter and we're like, that looks like our brother. That looks like, that's who we see at family reunions. That's who we see at community events. Those are the people in our spaces, in our church youth groups. And, when anything that we've been to, like that's the familiarity. The one who looks more foreign to us are the victims, whereas that shooter, might as well be, my cousin or, that's the guy I grew up playing baseball with. So it's just this conflicting feeling of, I don't know how I fit into, this discussion at all. And then I think maybe that's good, because then the attention really goes to those who really suffered, that tragic loss of life in their families. But it's like, yeah, what do I do with this? I don't know.
Well, you talked about even how Asian women and the over-sexualization of them. And with that, I feel like that is a huge part that's not being talked about at this point. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like
that's a very, it's raw, and I think it's raw in a lot of senses, because you do have, you sort of have to understand the dynamics that a lot of the women of Asian descent who are sort of working in, these marginalized and to different degrees sketchy positions, they're not doing that out of desire or choice. It's really an economic necessity is how they view that, because they're just trying to provide. They're just trying to provide for a family, for kids. And then you have the dynamic that for me, and for, men who grew up in America, just that our culture really divided men and women in took us on different paths, where you have the popular culture. Think about all of the movies that we had growing up, up till probably about 5 years ago, that the Asian was scrawny. The Asian man could not talk, was probably too shy to talk to a girl, was just used for math, or let's copy the homework off of the Asian kid and then, throw them into a locker and it's funny. Everyone can laugh about that, Whereas they didn't necessarily always portray the Asian woman that way. They were viewed more as exotic, or they were viewed as, something to be fetishized. And, again, submissive. So we have the more dominant man being able to submit, a foreign, fetishized woman of Asian descent.
Yeah.
So we have these so different sort of mindsets that, I think you would definitely get a much richer, different response, from an Asian American woman as opposed to me as an Asian American man.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. And I think when we talk about the media, though, I think that's something now, Gretchen, you said it doesn't sound like we're talking about that. And I would say that I've heard a lot about that. And so I think that's one of the issues I have with race relations. When I say race relations, it's not race relations themselves. It's that the way the media covers them, it only matches certain narratives. And this is completely off topic, but obviously it was a white person who did the shooting with these Asian women, and it immediately went to a racist white guy. And when the shooting happened in Colorado this week, when you look through Twitter, it was I think it was Mina, I forget her name, but Mina Harris, I think is her name. She's the niece of Kamala Harris. Tweeted out that white men are the biggest threat to America because they are shooting people. And then when they found out that it was a man who was Muslim, who was of Syrian descent, then it became about mental health. And it talked about the racism that he faced growing up, which caused him to do that. Whereas if you say anything about white people who shoot, then it's off limits. And so there's all these narratives, and it's kind of like when the media gets itself in a bind where it's like, oh, there's a white guy shooting. Good, we can go and we got him. And then it's like, oh, it's a Syrian Muslim man. What do we do here? And then it's, well, let's still make it about race. And I think that's one of the issues. And I think going back, that's the idea of ignorance versus racism. I mean, there's a lot of things that I just, like I said, I do have a bias. I did not know that things that you mentioned, Andrew, those things that you talk about, I'm like, no, that's, when I hear things like that, it's probably not real. So there's real issues out there we need to address, but then the media just kind of jumps and steers things. And I just want your thoughts as someone who's watching all of this Asian hate play out so quickly. How do you feel about the media coverage in general, and even with what's happened recently? Do you feel like it's good? And not just from when I say media, what I've talked about there was typically the liberal media, but also, I mean, really the only conservative media is Fox News. But how do you feel?
Oh, there's other conservative medias, but they're they go beyond Fox News.
Yeah, that's
OAN, Newsmax. There's other conservative medias.
Right.
But that's a great question. Are be honest that it cuts both ways. I will say that there is a side of me that appreciates that there is a tension, that this is a real thing. That Asians, Americans, and again, very different. That's a broad range of people, but that we do face situations that we see prejudice. We have bigoted statements and actions that are hurled at us, and that's not new. It's definitely not something. I mean, Google Vincent Chen, 1982.
Oh my God, that was
and
awful.
Also see a similar situation where, the white man that killed him, the judge and the jury, he was having a bad year. He lost his job as an auto worker. I could see him doing that. Heck, I would do it. So you have this view that it's nothing new. And
just to be clear, there is a link to that on the website. Vincent
Chen
was, it was in Detroit. He was an auto worker. And there was an auto worker.
He was not an auto worker.
He was not. But they were all out at a bachelor party, and there were two white guys who accosted him because they said that, Asian Americans were taking their jobs. And the judge actually in that case, because I did look this up, the judge was actually a POW, and I think it was the Vietnam War. So there was some bias there from the judge. And that became a big thing. So, there is a link to in the researchthenews.org to take a look at that article. But sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that people know the backgrounds of the stories we talk about.
Yeah, it's super helpful, right? But
the last part was he got 3. Sorry, I forgot the 3 years probation. That's what he got for. They beat this man with a baseball bat in the middle of the street.
Vincent Chen's life was 3 years of
probation. Yeah,
that's ridiculous.
It's
terrible.
But just continuing on. So in one sense, there's I appreciate that they're drawing attention that this stuff happens, because I think without any intention to it, how will there be change?
Right.
But I will say that, yes, it's opportunistic that, where have they been the last, 36 years, And a lot of times, honestly, crimes against Asians don't necessarily fit the narratives. I think there is, I would say, I see a narrative that we like to see, if it's more to the left media, we like to see white perpetrators. If it is, more to the right media, we like to see like a minority or Muslim perpetrator. But here, a lot of Asian crimes over the years, especially those in major metro areas, have just been, I would say, reflective of the spaces where Asians were congregating. So you think about the West Coast, you have, Asians in predominantly Black and, Latino communities, in New York City, the same thing, so you had these crimes that were happening, but the perpetrators were not white. They were not the white man, that these days the mainstream media likes to highlight as these are perpetrators. So the media looks at that and they're like, we don't know what to do with this. This doesn't really fit an agenda. This doesn't really drive forward anything we want to see accomplished legislatively, so this isn't our cause. So we'll just bury this as if it doesn't happen. But it has been happening. It isn't.
Yeah. It's almost like we've hit this plateau where everything has kind of culminated. My mom was saying when I was talking to her earlier, she's like, I just feel like the whole country is about to explode. And I was like, I feel like we've hit a point where we're boiling. And now everybody's really talking about the things that we should have been talking about this whole time. We've just been keep pushing things behind. Oh, well, it's not happening right now, so we don't have to deal with it. And then it pops back up and no, you're being opportunistic. Okay, well, when are we going to talk about it? When are we going to deal with it? And it just feels like after George Floyd and then Breonna Taylor and then this. So it's like, then we're just kind of hitting this. Now we're at this plateau. It feels to me like, I feel like change is happening, but I don't know how long it's going to take, but I don't know. I almost feel optimistic in a little weird way. So
I think it is. I mean, I think it's great to have these conversations. And I think that when bad things happen, it's good to have good conversations. And I think that's the problem I have with the media. And that, again, this is both sides. When we look at the conversations that happen, you brought up George Floyd. I often heard this summer, whether it was George Floyd or some other situations that happened, people on the right would say things like, well, he was passing bad money, or there are all these reasons why he was a criminal, and they'd look up their past and, well, this person did this in the past. And the left would say things like, well, why didn't you just have a less lethal shot? Let's just shoot him in the kneecap or something, or use a taser. And the idea of both those things, the person's background does not matter at all when the situations happen. It doesn't, if the situation's live, it only matters what's happening then. And the whole idea, if anyone's ever shot a gun, I think oftentimes when you hear things like, why didn't you use a less lethal shot? That person I can pretty clearly understand has never shot a gun before, because it's not like what you see in the movies where you can pick off a toe and it's Jack Bauer just kind of, shooting wherever he wants. And so that was the narrative. But then when you flip the narrative, when you saw what happened at the Capitol, there was that woman, Ashley Babbitt, that was shot. And when I looked at Twitter and when I looked at the media afterwards, the right was saying things like, why didn't you use a less lethal shot? You didn't have to shoot her. She was trying to climb through a window and try to get into Congress. And a person warned her and then shot her. And it was, why didn't you use less lethal shots? And then on the flip side, people who tended to be liberal were pulling up things that she had, her record, her criminal record of what she'd done in her past. And it's like, do y'all realize you're saying the exact same things just at different times because that's what the media is pushing you? And so when you say things like you're hopeful, that's hopeful for me, because when I look at how bad this world is right now, and I look at all the problems we have, they're not unique problems. There's this thing I haven't talked about in the show yet. There's this image right up here that if you're watching on the podcast, you won't be able to see my finger where it's pointing. But it's a autograph from a guy named Charles Sumner. Also a really cool story. I was listening to a podcast about the Haitian Revolution, and Charles Sumner was an anti-abolitionist congressman back in the 1800s, 1840s, 1850s. He was beaten on the Senate floor with a cane by a Southern Democrat who was for slavery at the time. Almost beat him to death. He was out of Congress for 2 years, and they both came back to Congress after the Civil War. So Charles Sumner recovered and came back to serve, and the Southern Democrat congressman that hit him came back and also became anti-slavery. And so when you look at things in history, I mean, the Capitol riot was absolutely terrible. It was disgusting what happened there. But we also had senators beating each other near death in the past. So I think the media turns everything into the end of the world, all sides, and it becomes this issue where we feel like the world's falling in around us. But I actually have a lot of hope, because I mean, we're having conversations here. I see a lot of people having real conversations. I see a lot of, in general with society, I don't see people on the streets having the problems that you see in the media. And I know there are real issues like what Andrew brought up here, things that I never experienced as a white man. and things that I want to be aware of. And that's why we have these conversations. And Andrew, what I love about this is Andrew's not calling me a racist or telling me because I'm white I wouldn't understand and I should just be quiet. He's having a conversation with me, and that's what's going to get us to move forward. And I think this is one of my soapboxes, but I watched a video this week that was talking about kind of the history of media. And right now there's like 5 major corporations that are in charge of 90% of the media that's out there. And that's not including things like Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men in the world, owning the Washington Post, one of the most influential newspapers in the world. That's still an independent one newspaper owner. So the idea that we have the ability now to make a change, I think there are things that are happening, but if we let the media direct that narrative into let's hate each other more, and here, if you listen to Fox News, it's, well, if you just wouldn't get in trouble, there's no issues. That's not a real thing. There's real racial issues we got to talk about it. And if you look at the liberal media, it's, well, all white people are racist, and if it fits our narrative, we're going to air it. And it becomes this whole self-hatred, even for, I joke around with my white liberal friends. It's, I don't understand how you wake up every day hating yourselves. It's tough. Like, there are real issues we need to face, but that doesn't help things. We have to be able to talk, and we have to be an ally, like Andrew talked about. And I think it's important to be able to say, hey, these are the things that are really offensive. And these are the things, and you know what, Andrew, I'm going to go into one thing. This is one thing that I did that it's so stupid. It's so dumb. And it's the reality of it. There was a picture that I actually deleted from Instagram this week of Andrew. He was in my car trunk, and we recreated he was in my car trunk. I
voluntarily went into Ray's car trunk.
Into my car trunk. And that was weird to say, but
2013, 2014.
You were
something like that, yeah.
young?
We were not really. We weren't that young. We were old enough to know better. Yeah.
30-ish.
But we were recreating The Hangover. And in hindsight, that is such a terrible, well, it makes sense, but it's also like, oh man, I can't believe I just made Andrew. And I didn't make Andrew. We thought it was funny, but it was, I was unintentionally taking Andrew down to, I think Ken Jeong, right? Is his name?
Ken Jeong, yep.
Oh, he's so funny.
Not only now, and something Andrew said when we were talking off air, he mentioned that Ken Jeong is not healthy because he takes a caricature of Asian, and maybe you can talk about this more, but not only did I put you in...
Ken Jeong is debatable. I think he has, his acting repertoire actually has increased, and I think he's recognized some things, that he did that did characterize Asians and Asian American men. So this is about grace. It's, Kim Jong can grow. I ain't canceling Kim Jong.
Sorry, did you say Ken Jong or Kim Jong?
Ken Jong.
Because if we're talking about Kim Jong-un,
Ken Jong.
That's all right. Ken Jong. Okay.
Ken with an N.
Ken.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and when you're looking at an artist, they're growing and they're learning and they're perfecting their craft, and
And again, I think it does reflect that there wasn't much roles for Asian American men even, 10 years ago. So he was taking roles that he could getting a foot in the door, and now, he has a career that allows him to not do that. I'm curious again what his thought is on some of those earlier roles that he did take. But again, my thing with, you stuffing me in the trunk, and again, it makes a cool picture.
I didn't stuff you in, though. I didn't physically shove you in there.
Trunk. I hopped in.
We talked about it. I didn't.
What if somebody who's just a bully in life, regardless of, their background, saw Ray's picture on Instagram and said, "Ho ho, I'm going to do that too." And they grabbed some, Asian boy or man who really didn't want to go into a trunk and threw them in their trunk. And I thought I would hate to be a part of that. To think that I helped instigate that matters.
But see, I think that's the thing where, I mean, I don't consider you a friend because you're Asian. I don't care that you're Asian. I consider you a friend because you're brutally honest, you're intelligent, you're a good guy, and I like you as a person. And through that, I've learned that I've had some things that are, again, looking back on it, now I would never do that. Well, I would hope so. And let me just be clear too, because I think going back to what you said, we should have some grace. Like, I would hope that you wouldn't think that I'm a terrible person because of something I did when I was younger and didn't know any better. But
we
the
all
reality
have
stuff
is, that could cancel us.
We all have
I think
stuff.
every single person, regardless of any political ideology, could be canceled in a second if somebody
Except
said,
for Mr. Rogers.
My goal today is to cancel them.
except Mr.
yeah.
Rogers. I'm so glad he hasn't been canceled yet.
I know. Oh my God, I love Mr. Rogers.
But I'm so glad that we have grace and we've learned and we've grown. And I think that's so important. I think that comes through conversation and through dialogue. And I mean, we've talked about this in the first episode, but growing up, I mean, I went to Penn Hills Elementary School in Pittsburgh, which is actually very diverse. But when I went to high school, I went to 3 different elementary schools. My junior high was almost all white. My senior high was 99% white. So it wasn't very diverse. And when I started working with Andrew in that inner city nonprofit, that was the first time I was really exposed to a culture that was primarily Black. And that was as an adult. And I learned so much there. And it's just when you get to know people, it's really good to hear these things. And I think that's where I go back to ignorance versus racism. And I think the more conversations we have, the better we'll be. And I just hope that as we kind of wrap up this week, we want to talk about what's next or what people learned. And I mean, I really can't pick one thing that I learned. So that's what I'm going to start out with, is what I learned. And there's just a lot that I've learned, not just today, but throughout knowing you, Andrew. But there are things that are clearly racist. There are things that are clearly bigoted. There's things you can just understand innately. And then there's a lot that you just don't understand. And I think what I've learned through you is that when you say things to people in a real way, an honest way, but not attacking them, they can really grow. And we as people who are, and when I'm saying as a white man, I'm not a minority, we need to listen when minorities are talking. And I feel like about their experiences. And I so appreciate you not telling me to be quiet because I'm not a minority, but actually sharing with me and growing with me. And I think that's how we're going to get through all this. And Gretchen, like you said, I think there is a lot of hope for me as we move forward. But that hope comes from conversations like this, and just, not from the media, not from those narratives, but from real conversations with real people that I see encouraging things happening. So that's what I learned this week.
Yeah.
Gretchen, do you want to go next with what you learned?
Yeah, it's really similar to what you just said, Ray. I feel that going even through this process of doing this podcast, I've grown so much in the last month. I feel like I am more open to listen to people that I have differences with. I feel like it's helping me understand my own bias. We talk about that every week, but it really listening to people that you don't necessarily have a lot in common with helps you grow. So the thing that I've learned, even in this episode, is that allowing myself to be told that I've done something wrong is not a bad thing. And I know it's hard for a lot of people to, it almost feels like an attack when someone says, please don't say that. It's offensive to me. And then they're automatically, oh, you're so offended, or you snowflake, whatever. But their response, I'm trying never to act like that anymore. I don't want to act like if someone's telling me that they are offended by something, or if I'm doing something that is offensive, I want to change that in myself. It's the empathy, right? It's that empathetic person inside I hate making people feel any kind of way that is not good about themselves. So, and I'm a teacher, so I'm sure that's where that comes from too. But even in this, things that I didn't know about Asian Americans, their history in this country, has opened my eyes to their plight every day and the things that they go through every day. And it is really heartbreaking to me. And I hope that I've never made anybody feel like that. I don't think I have. I don't think I've ever really said anything that would be offensive, but I mean, oh my gosh, fingers crossed. Like now, I'm
sure
like,
100%. You may not have known it. We all have said,
and that's why it so makes me sad. Do you know what I mean? Like I really am. There's like a little voice in the back of my head going, oh my gosh, you could have said something. It didn't mean anything. But I think we all need to be aware of that. It's not that you're policing your speech, or you're growing. And we should all be okay with growing and wanting people to have a good experience in their lives, because we only get one. Why would you purposefully make someone else's life horrible and make someone feel bad for the way they look or the way they talk, or it just is crazy to me. But that's really what I'm taking from this week. Heavier than most.
Well, and I think when we talk about minorities too, going back to the question, something else I learned when you talked earlier, Andrew, about the percentage of the world who was Asian, it's actually 59.51. So it's actually,
Oh, wow. It's
we
much
are
higher.
all minorities. So when you look at it from world population. Also, one real quick thing before I pass to Andrew to wrap up his comments today. Something else I learned, my co-founder, his wife, they texted me while I was doing this when I was talking about looking like Chris Hemsworth, and his wife's response was, "Oh, come on." And I can only assume it came right around the time of Chris Hemsworth. So just to be clear, I learned that I look nothing like Chris Hemsworth, but maybe I'll pull up some younger photos or something. But that's one thing I clearly learned. I do not look like Hemsworth.
I actually forgot that people are like literally watching us right now. Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Hey, everyone watching.
I keep forgetting that.
Andrew, I feel I'm going to leave this up to you. If there's anything you want to cover that I didn't cover, if there's something that you want to talk about that you learned, but most importantly, what I want to hear from you is what's next. So how do you, I did my little soapbox rant of how we can move forward from this and how we can learn, but I would love to hear from you on what you think we can do moving forward as a society that can help the problems we talked about today.
I appreciate that. And, it's just been awesome to be able to come and share with you guys, in a very loving civil environment, that's seems to be in short supply these days. But I think one thing that, when I hear you guys, like, I don't think anyone in America wants people of the majority culture to be walking around on eggshells thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to offend someone? That makes all of us uncomfortable. I think of the story in college where no one was willing to say that she's black. Yeah. Like they were so scared to utter the word black. Like, please, like, I don't want to live in that world either. Like in that moment, I'm like, oh man, I'm glad I'm not white. That's a lot of pressure. Like you guys have a lot of pressure. Like anything you could say could get you canceled. Anything you can say is like, oh my gosh, like they're racist. And once you get labeled with racist these days, you're gone. Shuffled off to the side. So please, like, don't. Majority culture, don't walk around on eggshells. But I do think there's value in let's all listen to each other. Let's be willing to listen and hear different perspectives. I think it is a troubling, sign that it seems like there are circles in our country where we have these polarized two sides and no one is willing to listen to the other side and just shut down. Like we listen to correct, we listen to shut you down, but let's listen to understand. Let's listen to gain new perspectives because it's those new perspectives that enrich us and allow us to gain a greater understanding. And at the end of the day, I think about this, that, when we were growing up and all of us are, older than millennials, that, like you didn't interact with people first on social media. Like that's backwards. Right. Like somebody friends me and then the first thing I know about them is their most controversial sort of like, aggressive tendencies. Yes. My gosh. Like back in the day, you got to know people based on, first spending a little bit of time with them and maybe hearing, oh, we have a common interest, whether it was at the water cooler or on the playground or in the lunchroom, and then you like, if you wanted to, you could learn more about them and see what else you had in common. But we've lost that. We've lost that as a society, all around the world. And it's like, let's get back to relationships. Let's get back to intentionality and relationships with maybe people who might look different than us or might have different backgrounds or different beliefs or different, dare I say, political ideologies, because there's something we can learn there. I mean, honestly, you always have to give credit to your spouse. And my wife has taught me so much that I never knew before. She's from such a different background. I'm Asian, cross-culturally adopted, Asian by white people. She's, black. And have I learned stuff that I'm like, oh my gosh, I never knew that. And that changed how I deal with things. That changes my perspective. Like I've had to correct myself on a lot of things, but that's been a process that I've really thoroughly enjoyed because now I know that I'm better off than where I was before. So let's take that approach. Let's say, what can I learn? Who can I listen to? And honestly, that doesn't mean we don't have an opinion. It doesn't mean that we don't, have things that we firmly believe are foundational, because I think there's strength in having a strong foundation. But we need to learn, again, how to communicate that in a civil manner and really start with that, legitimate, intentional relationship and then go from there. I think a good point that, we discussed a little bit, a few days ago, Ray, is that, as an Asian American, I have at different times received hateful actions and words from people of all different races, all different ethnicities. But because of my relationships with people of that same ethnicities, I know that not every fill in the blank is like this, that not every fill in the blank, treats people like this, because my relationships completely nullify the fact that there's a few people who, whether through their insecurities or whether through, unprocessed hate, that are going to lash out in the ways that the people that I've experienced have lashed out. I know that that's not the norm. I know that, I won't hold that against your whole group or your whole, whole people because of the example of a few.
Yeah.
Right. I love it. I love it so
Yeah.
much. Andrew, thank you so much for being on here. I'll always love talking to you. And again, I've said this before, but I'm not someone who can be fake. So when I would just avoid saying that I enjoy talking to you if I didn't enjoy talking to you. You're one of my favorite people. I'm not going to get in on the air about how you didn't invite me to your wedding and I found out about it afterwards, and that's really hard. I'm not going to get into that.
I don't think we have time for that.
We're running out of time. I'm just going to wrap it up now. There's a lot of factors there.
3 people away.
I hear it.
And I'm frustrated because there was at least 3 people who RSVP'd yes and didn't show up.
Of course.
That's who we can blame. And then the Dine and Dashers who were only there for like 25 minutes at the reception. Once they got fed, they were out. If I would have known that, I would have had you out in the parking lot at Three Lakes Golf Course ready to take their seat like that. I would have had you in there.
Oh my gosh.
I wish we would have had something that really got you fired up. I love fired up Andrew as well. But taking what you just said, I'm actually going to wrap up with some bad media and some good politicians this week. So we wanted to talk about researching the news, Asian American hates in the news, but I also want to talk about a few other things that are happening really quickly. If you haven't dug deeper, please dig deeper into these things. Number one, if you're not familiar with what's happening in Myanmar, please look up what's happening there. I just saw there was something like 114 people that were killed over the past few days by the military that overthrew Myanmar. It used to be called Burma. Now it's Myanmar. I actually looked at potentially traveling there because I wanted to find out more about them a couple of years ago.
Ew.
But there's a military coup, and it's shocking how little I'm hearing about it. You hear some things, but it's really crazy what's happening there. And it's scary, and we should be doing what we can to learn about it and find out how we can help.
Yeah.
My good politician of the week, which isn't a normal thing we're doing, I just picked it as a title. Bernie Sanders this week really impressed me. And here's the thing about Bernie Sanders. I would love to have a beer with Bernie Sanders and hang out with him, and I think he's a kook in some ways, but like in a good way. Like the thing I love about Bernie Sanders is that he really hasn't changed. And I was talking to Gretchen about this earlier. I don't like the fact that if you change your opinion, you're a flip-flopper. Because just like we talked about today, as you learn and grow and learn new things, you can change your mind. But his principles from the very beginning have been very consistent. And he hasn't changed his mind because he wants to gain something politically. He's always been Bernie Sanders, whether he was 20 years old or the way he is now. So I appreciate that about him. And one of the things, I feel like if you're a principled person, you're going to have to defend people and actions you don't like. And this week they were talking to him about Donald Trump's Twitter ban, and he said he wasn't comfortable with it, and basically said that was something that he didn't come out and say it should be overturned, but it was something he felt uncomfortable about. And it was really good to see someone because I feel like when we start breaking down these barriers where people are getting kicked off of these private platforms that are just so powerful, it's first off, to be clear, it's not the First Amendment, it's not the right to free speech, it's a private company, but they have so much power now that's so outsized that when you start kicking people off, it becomes an issue, especially when there's someone that's a president. I think a lot of what Donald Trump said on Twitter was just embarrassing and sometimes borderline. It was bad, but he's also someone who was president of the United States when that was taken down, and that's a huge issue when you're silencing someone like that. And I think if that was if it was Bernie Sanders that had his Twitter taken down, I don't necessarily agree with his platform, but he's also seems like a nice guy. I would never want to see his platform taken down, even if he tweeted the wrong thing. And I think that's where we got to be careful. Anytime I look at it as anytime our rights are being taken away or where people are being silenced, I don't care what political party, I don't care how bad really what you're saying is. I want you to be able to say it, because who is the one that's going to distinguish in the future what's actually bad speech and what's not? That's a whole other topic that goes into my constitutionalism. I'm not going to bore anyone else with more of it. But when you look at someone like Bernie Sanders, I think the core values, even with Bernie and I, we have totally different ways of getting there. And Andrew and I talked about this. It's kind of like a water park. We have all these different pipes that can lead to an exit, and that exit is the same. We don't.
Yep.
I don't want war. I don't want poverty. I want people getting opportunities. Bernie wants the same things. We have different ways of getting there.
Yeah.
But these kind of conversations are how we come together. And whether it's something like Bernie Sanders' idea of socialism, or whether it's talking about race relations, we need to learn from each other and grow with each other, and realize just because there are different ways of getting to a place, it doesn't mean that destination is different. And thank you, Andrew, for sharing your journey onto this destination. I tried to make it really like impactful at the end, and that was a stupid way to end it. I feel like
it was a little corny, but it was good.
I wish
I'm impacted,
in the
Ray.
same destination with me.
That was beautiful.
It was
Cheers
beautiful.
to
Thank
We
you,
landed
Andrew.
in the same pool.
Gretchen, I'm
Tied it
sorry,
all
but
together.
as Andrew, I mean, every time I talk to Andrew, he just makes me feel so good about myself. So I think we're going to have to replace. When I talked earlier about you having to do some other things, Andrew's going to be the new co-host just so he can be my hype man. I feel like that's...
Yeah.
Ray
But
Abel,
moving forward,
the
I will say
greatest
this.
man in the history of the world.
Okay,
Except
way
for
too
maybe
much.
one.
Way too much.
Dial it back.
Here's a challenge for our listeners, though. We are looking for some guests to talk about gun control. And also, I'm looking for someone who has some real experience with vaccines. And I'm not talking about researching on the internet or being a doctor not in the field. I'm talking about someone who's an how do you say that word?
Oh my!
I'm so glad I wasn't the only one who can.
Immunologist,
Okay, whatever.
immunologist.
Y'all know what we're talking about. Yeah. But I want to have a discussion about
immunize
that
people.
because I think that I actually have a vaccine appointment scheduled, and I'm also still a little bit concerned because there's been no long-term testing. And I think that's another topic where we have a lot of people that are picking sides politically, but not having real discussion. So if you want to talk about gun control, vaccines, feel free to reach out. And also feel free to share this podcast. I see some people watching live. You'll be listening to this on the podcast tomorrow, but feel free to tweet it out, share it. I think we have done some interesting conversations, and I look forward to more of them, but we want to get it out to more people so we can have these wonderful conversations and everyone can listen to how Andrew talk about how great I am. That's the key.
That's the
key to this
takeaway
all.
today. Ray is
So,
great.
if we wrap up, we always say one good thing. And this has
Yeah.
actually been a tough week for Gretchen and I, because we actually said earlier, what's one good thing that happened this week? And we both went, I'm not sure. Andrew, do you want to wrap us up with one good thing that's happened to you this week that's an encouraging story as people go through the rest of their weeks?
Thank you. Yeah, there's, you didn't ask me this question beforehand, so you put me on the spot, but that's all right. But, I would say, one good thing is just my daughter is 13 months old now, and she's walking around a lot more. She's babbling a lot more. And for the first time yesterday, we're more cautious with COVID, but everybody does things a little differently. So I'm not going to argue someone over that. They do what they do. We'll do what we do. But we took her to a public park and she got to ride in the baby swing. And, we got the video and the picture and,
No.
at first she was very she's usually very adventurous, but the little, the thing you hold in is a little bigger than her waist. So she sort of flew forward, obviously her legs still were in there, but then she's like, oh my gosh.
She's like,
what have I got my hand? So then she had to grab my hand the whole time.
She's
But
like,
we
hold
sort of
on.
rocked her back and forth. She was grabbing my hand, but it was her first time at a public park in the swing. So that is a good thing
that
happened.
is
That
a
is such a
great
good
new
story.
thing.
I'm so glad I threw you under the bus to just say it right there. And I will say that when I asked Andrew for a picture this week of for the promotional clip I put on Facebook, he sent me a really cute picture of him with his daughter. They were in the snow and she was in a laundry basket. And I told him, well, we
Laundry
don't want to
basket
put
sled.
her up on the website. I probably am going to print that out and hang it. I might take down that Charles Sumner photograph I talked about and put that picture in honor of Andrew. So thank you for that as well, Andrew. But all right. Well, thank you again for being on the show, Andrew. Gretchen.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you as always. And we're going to wrap up this week, but feel free to check in next week. As of now, it's going to be Gretchen and I talking about how we can disagree, because even she said that she's learning and open, and we've already had some issues where we've interpreted each other slightly differently. So what does it mean to actually have disagreements and be able to talk through them? And I think that's an important thing. And if there's any psychologists out there that want to talk us through it, feel free to reach out as well. So gun control, vaccines, psychology, feel free to reach out. So Thank you again for listening to Research the News. We look forward to coming back soon. And again, share it. Thanks. Have a great rest of the week.